It's wonderful to see you all, dear colleagues, friends, and participants that we cannot see, but we know you are many across the different continents of the world. The beauty of this challenging time is that we can have events like this one today, where so many participants can join from different sides of the world. My name is David Donat Catten. I am the Secretary General of the Parliamentarians for Global Action. We will start at past 30. In my time on this side of the Atlantic, it's going to be 6:30 p.m. In Canada and New York will be 12:30 p.m. And I will then at 0:30 start to present the distinguished speakers that we have with us today. This is one of the many activities that Parliamentarians for Global Action is happy to co-facilitate with the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. There is a lot of work that is being done in the framework of a new partnership called Democratic Renewal and Human Rights Campaign by PGA. And a lot of action is being conducted in support of human rights and democratic principles, especially when they are threatened, when there are attacks on parliamentarians, when human rights defenders are most at risk. And this work could have not been possible without the support of Global Affairs Canada. I know that some of our colleagues from the Foreign Ministry from Global Affairs Canada will be in attendance, and we will acknowledge their support. The partnership was born, the president of PGA, Margareta Cederfelt, is remembering it, and of course, Professor Kotler also is remembering it. The partnership was born out of a great meeting we organized in New York on the 17th of July, 2018, where we also were attending a side event to the UN high-level UN Political Forum, and this was also International Justice Day, marking the 20th anniversary of the Rome Statute. But we had a bilateral meeting between our president and the president of the Raoul Wallenberg, and I think today is the first public event out of that wonderful decision to partner together and promote human rights and democracy all over the world. Well, now it's point 30, and I'm delighted on behalf of Parliamentarians for Global Action and the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights to open this webinar on the Magnitsky-type legislation or laws or acts or regulation that are considered by our global parliamentary network and certainly by the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights a fundamental tool to underpin the fight for human rights and against grand corruption all over the world. There are important legislative processes ongoing. There are measures that some states have already undertaken, and all these achievements have been made possible by the tireless work of a human rights advocate who happens to be also a businessman, Mr. Bill Browder, who's joining us today. He will be the first speaker. Is holding the position of CEO of the Hermitage Fund, and he has been an advocate who worked relentlessly throughout the year to promote this type of measures in the name of Sergei Magnitsky, who will certainly remember in his speech. The second speaker is the president of Parliamentarians for Global Action, Margareta Cederfelt, who is a Swedish parliamentarian and currently also sits as the vice president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. She was elected president of PGA in 2017, and in the OSCE and during the, of course, her PGA tenure, PGA launched a new campaign on democratic renewal and human rights, inter alia. But during this OSCE tenure, she has also been the rapporteur of the Commission of Inquiry on the assassination of Russian opposition leader Boris Nemtsov, which led her to publish a report that had an enormous impact recently. The last and always the most important speaker is Professor Irving Kotler. Irving Kotler has been the Attorney General of Canada and Minister of Justice. He has been a long-standing parliamentarian, a leader also of the PGA National Group. And today he sits as chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, by no doubt one of the most dynamic think tanks in the world that supports parliamentarians, decision makers, policy makers, academics, NGOs, opinion leaders, the media. I can continue, of course, the list. Professor Kotler, of course, is an emeritus professor at McGill University, and is joining us from Canada. So to cut a long story short, we are now today discussing how to contribute to the prevention and the, if possible, repression of gross human rights abuses and kleptocracies, or events that may lead to the impoverishment of entire nations, thereby putting their survival at risk. Bill, why don't I give you immediately the floor? I will take more time later on to say a few words about PGA and its work, but I consider that what our participants wants to hear from you first. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Davide and Margherita and Erwin, for coming together to organize this. I'm very honored to be among such esteemed and wonderful people. Let me just quickly introduce myself, how I'm connected to this whole story, and then let me tell you the story, my story, and how it led to Magnitsky, and how it led to this new legislative tool, which I believe evens the levels the playing field slightly in a very brutal and unjust world. So my name is Bill Browder. I'm 56 years old. I'm originally from the United States. I come from an unusual family background. My grandfather was the head of the American Communist Party in the 1930s and 1940s. And so as a rebellion from my family of communists, I put on a suit and tie and became a capitalist. I went to Stanford Business School. I graduated in 1989, which was the year that the Berlin Wall came down. And I thought, what if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has come down, I'm going to try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. I ended up moving to Russia. I set up an investment fund called the Hermitage Fund. It actually grew to become the largest investment fund in the country. And I discovered that all the companies I was investing in were effectively being robbed blind in a total free-for-all of Russian oligarchs and Russian officials. And so I started to research how they went about stealing the money, exposing the people who were stealing the money in large companies like Gazprom, the state gas company, and Sberbank, the national bank. And these exposés led to all sorts of antagonism about what I was doing. And I was expelled from the country in November of 2005. I was declared a threat to national security of Russia because of my anti-corruption work. My offices were then raided in Moscow in 2007 by the police. And they seized all of our documents and then used those documents to perpetrate a highly complex $230 million tax rebate fraud. And the way we discovered this fraud was that a young lawyer named Sergei Magnitsky, who worked for me, was tasked with investigating this fraud. And I should point out that it wasn't our money that was being stolen. It was money that we had paid, $230 million we had paid to the Russian government in a highly complex maneuver involving government officials, was stolen from the Russian government. Sergei, who discovered this, then exposed it. He testified against the officials involved. And then he was subsequently arrested by the same officials he exposed. He was put in pretrial detention. He was tortured in order to get him to withdraw his testimony. They put him in cells with 14 inmates and 8 beds and left the lights on 24 hours a day to impose sleep deprivation. They put him in cells with no heat and no window panes in December in Moscow, so he nearly froze to death. They put him in cells with no toilet, just a hole in the floor where the sewage would bubble up. They'd move him from cell to cell to cell. And the purpose of all this is they wanted to get him to withdraw his testimony against the corrupt police officers and they wanted to get him to sign a false confession to say that he stole the $230 million, and he did so on my instruction. And Sergei was a man of incredible integrity and principle, and for him, the idea of perjuring himself and bearing false witness was more painful than all the physical pain they were subjecting him to, and he refused. The torture got worse and worse and worse, and after about 6 months of this, he started to develop terrible pains in his stomach. He lost 20 kilos. He was diagnosed as having pancreatitis and gallstones, and he needed an operation, which they scheduled in August of 2009. A week before the operation, the officials came to him again asked him to withdraw his testimony. Again, he refused. And in retaliation, they abruptly moved him to a new prison, a maximum security prison called Butyrka, where there were no medical facilities. And at Butyrka, his health completely broke down. He went into constant agonizing pain, and the authorities refused to provide him any medical attention, which he had been promised before. He and his lawyers wrote 20 different desperate requests for medical attention. Every one of their requests was either ignored or denied in writing. And on the night of November 16, 2009, almost 11 years ago, Sergei Magnitsky went into critical condition. On that night, the Butyrka authorities didn't want to have responsibility for him anymore, and so they put him in an ambulance, sent him to a different prison facility, one that had a medical wing. But when he arrived there, instead of putting him in the emergency room, they put him in an isolation cell. They chained him to a bed, and 8 riot guards with rubber batons beat him until he died. He was 37 years old. He left a wife and 2 children. I got the news of his murder the next morning, and it was by far the most traumatic thing I'd ever experienced in my life. Sergei Magnitsky was effectively killed as my proxy. He was killed because he was my lawyer. And when I was finally able to get over the horrifying adrenaline of the moment and all the emotions and think clearly, it became obvious to me that there was really only one thing I could do, which was to put aside all my other activities and focus all of my time, all of my resources, and all of my energies on going after the people who killed him and make sure they face justice. And we know a lot about what happened to Sergei because he wrote everything down. He wrote, during his time in detention, he wrote 450 complaints documenting who did what to him, where, how, and when. And we had a copy of, he would write those by hand them to his lawyer once a month. The lawyer would file them. The authorities would either ignore them or reject them, but we got copies. And it's the most well-documented human rights abuse cases ever come out of Russia. The evidence was incontrovertible. And we figured that on the back of that, they would at least have to imprison and prosecute the executors of this crime. Maybe not the orderers, but the executors. But that didn't happen. The Putin regime circled the wagons. They gave promotions and state honors to some of the people who were most complicit. And in the most shocking miscarriage of justice, they put Sergei Magnitsky on trial 3 years after they killed him. It was the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia, and they found him guilty. As a result, it became clear from all of their actions that there was no possibility of getting justice inside of Russia. So I said, how do we get justice outside of Russia? And I looked around, and effectively there were no tools for getting justice outside of Russia for a crime like this that was committed inside of Russia. The European Court for Human Rights, which is a great institution, doesn't prosecute people, it prosecutes the country. It usually takes anywhere from 6 to 10 years. And the penalty in the Magnitsky case, the Magnitsky family was awarded a judgment against Russia, and they still haven't paid with the 50,000 euros that they were supposed to. The International Criminal Court doesn't deal with cases like this. You have to have 100,000 dead, not one dead. Universal jurisdiction, which is a great concept in law, but doesn't actually work. And when I realized that there were no legal mechanisms for getting justice, I couldn't accept that. And so I said, if there are no legal mechanisms, then we need to create our own legal mechanism. And I went to Washington, and I told the same story I'm just sharing with you today with 2 senators, a Republican, a Democrat from Maryland, Senator Benjamin Cardin, and a Republican from Arizona, John McCain. And I shared the story, and I said, there's one thing I think we can do, which would be very powerful, which is the people who stole the $230 million and killed Sergei Magnitsky, they don't keep their money in Russia. they keep their money in the West, in New York and in London and in Geneva and in Paris and Rome. They buy villas and they send their girlfriends on shopping trips and they send their kids to boarding schools. And so I said, can we freeze their assets and ban their visas? I said to these two senators. And they said yes. And that became known as the Magnitsky Act. It was launched as a legislative proposal in October of 2010. And it originally just went after the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky. And then all of a sudden their phones started lighting up from other victims in Russia saying that you've found the Achilles heel of the Putin regime. Can you sanction the people who killed my husband, my brother, my sister, my aunt? And after about a dozen of these calls, these two senators realized they were on something much bigger than just one case. They were effectively had stumbled into a new legal concept. And so they added 65 words to the Magnitsky Act to include all other gross human rights abuses in Russia. And then it went across Capitol Hill and it went viral, and all other victims started coming out and telling their stories. And it went for a vote in November of 2012, and it passed the Senate 92-4. It passed the House of Representatives with 89%, and it became a federal law in the United States, signed by President Obama on December 14th, 2012. At that moment, Putin went out of his mind. He banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families, which was effectively, because many of those orphans were sick and disabled, he was effectively sentencing some of his own orphans to death as a way of trying to retaliate against the Magnitsky Act. And second thing he did is he made it his single largest foreign policy priority to repeal the Magnitsky Act in America and to stop it from spreading abroad. And I'm pleased to say he hasn't succeeded. Instead of stopping it, these two senators said, well, if Vladimir Putin is so upset about this, then surely other dictators will be as well. Let's make it global. And they introduced the Global Magnitsky Act. The Global Magnitsky Act went through the legislative process and it became a federal law in December 2016. On that same day, the Estonian parliament unanimously passed an Estonian Magnitsky Act, and it's a law on their books in Estonia. Following that, and with the unbelievable perseverance, help, and ingenuity of Professor Erwin Kotler here on the call, Canada, after probably a 7-year fight, we got the Canadian Parliament unanimously in both houses of Parliament to pass a Canadian Magnitsky Act. A month later, on the anniversary of Sergei Magnitsky's death, the Lithuanians unanimously passed the Lithuanian Magnitsky Act, followed by the Latvians, followed in the UK by the UK Magnitsky Act, followed by Kosovo, a Kosovo Magnitsky Act, followed by all of the British Crown protectorates, Jersey, Gibraltar, Cayman Islands, Isle of Man, Guernsey have Magnitsky Acts. And we now have a number of places on deck. The most important, the biggest prize will be the EU. In December of last year, the European Council agreed in principle to a European Magnitsky Act. Joseph Borrell, the head of the External Action Service, was tasked with writing it. I've seen a copy, I've seen a draft, which I can discuss in more detail after the end of my talk here. And then we also have an Australian Magnitsky Act, which has just been working its way through the parliament there. There's a proposal for Japanese Magnitsky Act. There's a proposal for a Swiss Magnitsky Act. There's a proposal for a Norwegian Magnitsky Act. And in principle, this can and should and will become a global standard for holding human rights violators and kleptocrats to account. It's been implemented in roughly 200 cases in America, and the list is long. And in fact, just today there was some more people added to the global Magnitsky list. And let me tell you, the people who get added are not happy. I will leave it there. I've probably gone over time, but I'm really glad that we're having this conversation today, and look forward to thoughts, questions, and the other speakers.
Thank you, Bill. And this is the best way for our organizations to celebrate International Day of Democracy, which is today, the 15th of September, because our membership and all the people we work with, especially in civil society, they want to have concrete legislative tools to move the agenda forward, the agenda of human rights. And I think what you have done is really, really important for all of us. Now, I'm very delighted to give the floor to the person I'm accountable to, because every one of us is accountable to somebody else, and the president of PGA, Margareta Sedelfert from Stockholm. Margareta.
Thank you very much, David. Esteemed parliamentarian colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Parliamentarians of Global Action, I would like to thank our partner of this event, the Roald Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, and its chair, Professor Irving Kotler, and Mr. Bill Broder, who spoke a few minutes ago, for accompanying us today to discuss the Magnitsky-Type Sanctions as a tool for members of Parliament to prevent and punish human rights abuse.
Margareta,
yes,
we cannot see you. Okay,
no,
now we can see you. Okay.
Thank you very much. But you can hear me.
Always, we have heard everything, yes.
Very good, thank you so much. Yeah. And I think Bill Broder's presentations says everything about why we need the Magnitsky Act. And I will give a perspective of my view as both parliamentarian, as I am a member of the Swedish Parliament, but also from my perspective as the rapporteur of from OSCE Parliamentary Assembly on the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, and of course my perspective as president of Parliamentarians for Global Action. PDA works, as you will have more about a few minutes a little bit later, by our Secretary General David Donald Carter, with human rights and support parliamentarians all over the world to work for human rights and rule of law. There is an increasing consensus on the global decline of democracy, illustrated by the erosion of principles of separation of powers, independence of just judiciary, and equality before the law. Observers and actors have witnessed the rising perpetuation of disinformation, incremental dismantling of protection for press freedoms. There is in most countries today a lack of tools to address human rights abuse, including those of opposition and dissidents. The two cases I will briefly present are at the core of the Magnitsky-type sanctions. To curb online speech, the Kremlin has released vague laws that criminalize extremism and incitement of hatred and or hostility, since protected categories under Russian law include any social groups. Citizens have been accused of hate speech for posting critical comments on the police, for instance. The most recent case is that of the Alexei Navalny, who is a current and prominent face of the Russian opposition to President Vladimir Putin. He is a politician and an anti-corruption activist who has organized large protests and has been outspoken on the social media against the regime. On August the 20th, on a flight from Siberia, he fell violently ill. Mr. Navalny's German medical doctors have determined that he had been poisoned by a military chemical nerve agent of the Novichok group. And all over the world, there have been speeches against this. There have been activities on different levels. For example, the European Union and its member states and other countries, such as the United States, have expressed outrage and are considering taking sanctions against individuals or entities who have conceived and carried out the assassinations attempt. On September the 3rd, the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Mr. Josep Borrell, condemned the assassination attempt and went on to say that the use of chemical weapon is completely unacceptable, constitutes a serious breach of international law and international human rights standards. The European Union calls for joint international response and reserves the right to take appropriate actions, including through restrictive measures. Such restrictive measures refer to sanctions against individuals who would be banned from traveling to the EU and would have any assets they hold in the EU frozen. Broader economic and political sanctions could also be envisaged based on the attribution of responsibility to state actors for the attack against Mr. Navalny. The attack may have entailed several breaches of international legal obligation that are binding for the Russian Federation under the Chemical Weapons Convention, the European Convention on Human Rights, and other treaties to which Russia is a contracting party. On September the 10th, the United States told the UN Security Council that it would work with allies to hold accountable the individuals responsible for poisoning Mr. Navalny. The UN ambassador of Germany, Christoph Horskem, said Berlin was working with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons on the case and urged Moscow to do the same. The second case, the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, as I said, I was rapporteur for. And I would also like to just to mention that those of you who haven't read the report, you are mostly welcome to visit the OSCE PA homepage, because the report is there. The report is also could be found on the US Congress homepage under the Human Rights Commission. When Mr. Boris Nemtsov was killed on February the 27th, 2015, he was a leading politician within the opposition and the former Deputy Prime Minister of Russia. At the time of his death, he was a member of the Yugoslav Regional Duma. He was a very famous figure in Russia. People adored him, people requested his support, and he was working with a case of corruption and as well on soldiers who were sent to Ukraine, and he was going to put the cases in front of the court. And it was in the support of the families from the soldiers. The investigation into the murder is filled with irregularities, inconsistent statements, and of unclear circumstances. The same goes for the trial and for the conviction of the 5 Chechenian men for killing Mr. Nemtsov. Writing the report, it has become clear to me that the evidence upon which the 5 men were prosecuted and convicted is utterly weak, and there is no transparency in the legal process. Mr. Nemtsov was gunned down in central Moscow at the Bolshoi-Moskovitsky Bridge next to Kremlin. And it's incredible because there is no such thing as any evidence on the shooting, on the murder. Nobody has seen anything. Nobody have heard anything. And this is otherwise the most, the place where there are most eyes and most guarded place in Moscow and in all Russia. Available evidence and witness statements were not collected and are not part of the investigation. In no state where there is an independent judiciary would a similar case proceed to trial and result in conviction. And during my work, I have sought contact with the Russian authorities to get access to material related to the criminal investigation. My requests were denied with reference to the law on state secret, or even I didn't get any response at all. I also have requested a meeting with the Russian ambassador to Sweden. He canceled the meeting the same day as it should happen. The implication of the Nemtsov murder must be understood in relation to the abuse of political power, the absence of rule of law, and the corruption. From that perspective, it's obvious that the murder of Mr. Nemtsov and the attack on Mr. Navalny is representative for the repressive tactics which is pursued in President Putin's Russia. The assassination of Boris Nemtsov didn't end his work. There are marches every year in his memory. There are as well guarding the place where he was shot, 7 days a week, 24 hours, and always fresh flowers on the spot. He remained after the murder a unifying figure for dissidents, and we as representatives of democratic and free political systems, we must not forget that the people of Russia deserve a better society than there is today. The UK has made significant contribution to end the Russian repression. A statement asking to review the efforts into the investigation was delivered to the OSCE Permanent Council by Ambassador Niall Bush earlier this year, and the Magnitsky-Type Sanctions regime targeting several Russian nationals has been announced. Imposing sanctions is instrumental in demonstrating the significance of democratic values. The names of those who failed to investigate the assassination of Mr. Nemtsov, as well as other oppositional figures, should be added to that list, and the Magnitsky Act of the European Union should also be adopted. The tireless efforts by US senators and members of the Congress to bring attention to the Boris Nemtsov case is instrumental in particular. I would like to just mention the Resolution 156 passed by the Congress and the Resolution 81 by the Senate, calling for accountability and justice for the assassination. There are as well many other authorities and human rights defenders that have raised awareness of the case, such as the Office of UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN Human Rights Committee, the European Court of Human Rights, the Special Rapporteur of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, Mr. Tsingeris. I just described two cases in which the international community decided to consider sanctions, economic ones, to punish individuals responsible for violating fundamental human rights of political opponents. There have been more cases of persecution of opposition leaders. Magnitsky-type sanctions tend to have severe consequences for individuals and governments. There is no democracy without respect for rule of laws. I urge legislators around the world to work towards mobilizing political will. As parliamentarians, we have the duty to address the climate of impunity to ensure that those who violate the domestic and international rule of law do suffer the consequences. Legislators can strengthen institutions such as the judiciary apparatus. We can question our government's actions or inactions on topics of international interest. Parliamentarians are as well guardians of multilateralism by holding our governments accountable to international instruments ratified. To conclude, few countries have adopted legislation on targeted sanctions against human rights abuses. Among the countries with the Magnitsky-type legislation, there is Canada and the United States. There are initiatives in a few European countries, and as Mr. Broder said, there are more on the line. Similar recommendations have been adopted by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and the European Parliament. I urge all fellow parliamentarians to discuss and pass legislation that imposes targeted sanctions on individuals, governments, and non-states and entities involved in human rights abuses. We should all remain vigilant, as the protection and strengthening of democracy requires sustained and collective efforts. And in my opinion, it's our duty as elected parliamentarians. We have to protect our people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margareta. And we are perfectly on time now to give the floor to Erwin Kotler. Let me just stress how important is the references that you made to the case of Boris Nemtsov, the ongoing case of Mr. Navalny, which is still to be investigated and to be disclosed. And this shows the impetus that still this topic carries with our global society. Professor Kotler, I would like you to maybe take into consideration other situations outside Russia, because as Margareta said, parliamentarians have an enormous role to play. They are opinion leaders, they are legislators, they can make their government accountable, they can guide the politics towards a certain direction, especially if they are bipartisan, as the experience of Bill and also of your side in Canada enlightened us so well towards that objective. So, Professor Kotler, the floor is yours to a little bit maybe broaden this very important topic on a global scale, and then we will have the last 20 minutes for the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, David. May I begin by commending Bill Browder, who's the father of the architect of the global Justice for Sergei Magnitsky movement, who demonstrated how one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act can transform, literally transform history. And in fact, Bill inspired the establishment at our Raoul Wallenberg Center of the Global Justice for Sergei Magnitsky project. I'm delighted also to be joining Margarita, the president of PGA, special rapporteur regarding the OSCE and inquiry into Boris Nemtsov, and David Donakatan, who I've known for so many years, worked together in common cause. Now it's Secretary General. And we are delighted at the Raoul Wallenberg Center to be partnering with you in the overall promotion and protection of democratic resilience and renewal, something which is particularly important and resonates on this International Democracy Day. Indeed, we meet at an important inflection moment from a historical perspective. We are not only experiencing a global COVID pandemic, we are experiencing a global political pandemic that finds expression in a resurgent global authoritarianism, of which Russia is only one example. As you correctly mentioned, David, we also have China's CCP. We also have Khamenei's Iran, and I keep using these terms to distinguish it from the people and publics who otherwise the targets of mass repression in these countries, and I refer also to Venezuela, etc. And so we are seeing this resurgent global authoritarianism. We are seeing an assault on a rules-based international legal order, which is underpinned by cultures of criminality and corruption and the impunity that also fuels it. We are seeing also a digital authoritarianism that incentivizes hate. And so with all this, regrettably, we are witnessing, and I'm saying this on International Democracy Day, at the same time, an erosion of democracy, the retreat of democracies, the sometimes silence of democracy, the dysfunction of democracy, and therefore the particular and compelling importance of an organization like the Parliamentarians for Global Action on International Democracy Day to renew and to reinvigorate the struggle for the promotion and protection of democracy. And so what can we do? And I'll take your references, David, into account to globalize the approach. Let me a number of one-liners for reasons of time as to what we can do, and in particular what parliamentarians in concert with civil society and governments can do. One, we need to internationalize the Justice for Sergei Magnitsky movement, to create a global constituency of conscience, to secure justice for victims and accountability for human rights violators. And the PGA, as I mentioned, can play a crucial role in this, along with the Interparliamentary Group of Justice for Sergei Magnitsky, which Bill Browder founded. Number two, we need to appreciate, because sometimes this is understood, that Magnitsky sanctions don't target a particular country or state, that Magnitsky sanctions target major human rights violators, those who are engaged in gross human rights violations like extrajudicial executions, torture, crimes against humanity, and the like. And Boris Nemtsov, who you referenced, Margarita, played a crucial role in the establishment of Magnitsky sanctions in Canada, in the US, etc. And paid for it, I believe, also with his life with regard to that role that he played, among other things, in the Justice for Sergei Magnitsky movement. But one of the things he said in Canada, which was so important, because somebody said, aren't Magnitsky sanctions anti-Russian? He said, no, they are pro-Russian. They are in behalf of the Russian people. And that is true in whatever country we establish them. They are on the behalf of the citizens of that country. They are on the behalf of the pursuit of justice in that country, which leads me to a third point. And we need to understand the crucial role that parliamentarians have played and can play, both in the adoption of Magnitsky sanctions and then in the subsequent implementation of those sanctions. Magnitsky sanctions were adopted in Canada because of the parliamentary initiatives, parliamentary motions, parliamentary hearings, parliamentary adoption. And in fact, I remember on the cusp of when the votes were to take place in Parliament, Russian authorities warned Canada that if they were to enact Magnitsky sanctions, Russia would retaliate. And here the coming together of civil society with parliamentarians, our Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, which has an all-party parliamentary group for human rights, convened, and we said, look, we cannot allow parliamentarians or Canada to be intimidated. We not only have to adopt Magnitsky sanctions, we have to adopt it unanimously to send a message that we won't be intimidated. And I'm delighted, as Bill Brown mentioned, that Magnitsky sanction legislation was adopted 277-0 in the House of Commons, replicated like that in the other house in the Senate, signed immediately into law by the Governor General. This was the parliamentary response to the Russian threat at that point. And so we need to understand the importance where civil societies work together with parliament and governments in that regard. Number 4, parliamentarians can play a crucial role in making the pursuit of justice not only a domestic priority, but a foreign policy priority. And here too, the importance of PGA and parliamentarians in this regard. Let me also reference that we recently founded the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, where we have parliamentarians from some 25 democracies to hold CCP's China accountable with respect to things such as the mass atrocities, if not acts constitutive genocide against the Uyghurs, the national security legislation re Hong Kong, etc., imprisoning more journalists than any other country in the world. And we have recommended in our hearings, in our meetings, the adoption of Magnitsky sanctions to sanction the particular Chinese officials that are involved, for example, in the mass atrocities against the Uyghurs or the national security legislation. Number 5, we need to appreciate that Magnitsky sanctions not only can combat impunity in the countries where the cultures of corruption and criminality take place, but they also protect, through the application of visa bans, through asset seizures and the like, they protect our sovereignty, our security, our economy, our citizens, our justice. And so really, you've got here a framework for democratic protection and renewal in every country in which such Magnitsky sanctions are adopted. Number 6, Magnitsky sanctions need to increasingly begin to be used to protect media freedom and to protect journalists. As Amal Clooney has pointed out in her landmark report on the use of Magnitsky sanctions to protect journalists and protect media freedoms, Magnitsky sanctions have rarely been used to protect media freedom. We now have to see that the protection of media freedom through the use of Magnitsky sanctions effectively means the protection of democracy, since media freedom is the lifeblood of a democracy. And so we have to change the paradigm, as Amal Clooney put it. We have to change the paradigm from impunity to accountability and hold those who are imprisoning, threatening, murdering journalists accountable. Number 7, moving to close, that Magnitsky sanctions can also be used to protect parliamentarians and human rights defenders who are increasingly under assault. And I want to commend PGA, and we're delighted to partner with them for the establishment of a rapid response team that can move quickly, where parliamentarians can move quickly, and where Magnitsky sanctions could be one of the tools and resources for that purpose. And finally, we need to engage the various intergovernmental alliances, and parliamentarians can do this. Whether we talk about the G7, whether we talk about the OSCE, whether we talk about the OAS, whether we talk about Asian Pacific, parliamentarians have to be at the forefront of engaging these governments, of engaging these alliances, and bringing them to adopt and implement Magnitsky sanctions. To, in a word, bring about, as I mentioned, not only justice for victims and accountability for human rights violators, but through that, the promotion and protection of our democracies on International Democracy Day. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Professor. You cover so many things, and I think now we are also being inundated by additional questions. But let me just stress one aspect that I consider very important here. You mentioned the fight against impunity. It's an area where PGA has developed leadership since 1989. And it is really what we see today, that the attacks on democracies are as such that there is almost a direct connection between the impunity of the perpetrators and the fact that certain regimes or groups can gain and maintain power at the detriment of the people. And what we are looking at first in PJ is the victims, the rights of the victims, the voice of the victims. I believe this is happening today as it was happening before the current pandemics, because we have sort of a natural disaster, the coronavirus outbreak worldwide, and we have a man-made disasters, normally made by men, not by women, let's call it man-made disaster, which is the attacks on democracy, on the rule of law and human rights, and the crimes associated and the impunity stemming from it. So I think we have a lot to say about it. One of the questions that came through, Bill, from a number of participants that yesterday sent us 35 questions is, what do we do with Magnitsky-type sanctions in situations like, for example, the example was made Ecuador, or certain African countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, and so on, where there are serious violations of human rights. There is a rampant examples of corruption, but we are not yet facing a full-fledged dictatorship or an oppressive regime that is controlling all aspects in society. So can the Magnitsky-type sanctions be useful also in these types of cases?
Absolutely. So let me give you an example. South Africa. South Africa is not a dictatorship. South Africa even has a rule of law. But South Africa, over recent years, has been hijacked by three brothers called the Gupta brothers, working together with President Zuma, and effectively stripping from the state all sorts of resources that should have been enjoyed by the South African people. The South African judiciary and the South African regulators, for whatever reason, haven't been able, and this is something that everybody has known. This is not a mystery. This is not there's not a other side to the story. Everybody has been suffering in South Africa because of this. But the South African judiciary and the South African government, for whatever reason, couldn't organize themselves to prosecute this group of people. And so in the end, the only justice for the South African people has come from the United States, where the Gupta brothers were all placed on the global Magnitsky Sanctions list. And it was remarkable, the day that it happened. It was like I mean, I could almost feel the applause from South Africa to the United States of the people saying, finally, there's some kind of justice being done. And so that's a perfect example. You don't need a sort of Chinese concentration camps to justify Magnitsky sanctions. You can have a situation like that. The purpose of these sanctions is to create justice and to fight impunity where impunity exists. And impunity could exist because of dictatorships, and it could exist because of a weak government or weak judiciary, or corruption within the government and corruption within judiciary. And so it's something which I think there's something like 26 countries that have had individual sanction under the U.S. Magnitsky Act, and I hope that there'll be many more in the future.
Thank you, Bill. And Professor Kotler, there are a number of questions relating to the Canadian situation. Questions asking about whether we can assess the process of designation of individuals to be sanctioned as too slow, or if there are obstacles in implementing the Canadian law. So this is coming from a number of participants. I may also address to you and to Margareta the question about why in certain countries, especially in Europe, it has taken so much time for legislators, for governments to be supportive of this type of measures. If you see some obstacles that need to be, let's say, overcome before to move forward with these legislative processes. Professor Kotler.
Yeah, if I may, just to follow up also on Bill Browder, because it's a related thing. He mentioned South Africa, but I think the Philippines is another example which is engaged in not only in extrajudicial executions, but in threatening and imprisoning journalists who expose it, such as Maria Ressa of the Rappler. And it is a case study in the emerging threats of digital authoritarianism, of the weaponization of social media, where online hate leads to offline violence. And I think here we too, and parliamentarians, have a role to play to see that these technological behemoths like Facebook, that there is accountability. For example, in Canada, Facebook does not pay any taxes, is immune from suit and the like. And that's why I'm delighted that I believe Canadian parliamentarians are now considering legislation to combat hate on the internet, so as to protect from moving from online hate to offline violence. Now, you mentioned with regard to the Canadian situation and process of designation as being too slow. The process of designation must be deliberative, because we need to ensure also the appropriate due process protections. And right now, the process of deliberation is largely through the decision-making at the executive level and through the Minister of Foreign Affairs. What I do think we need a greater involvement of Parliament and expert groups of parliamentarians in the designation of those who should be targeted for Magnitsky sanctions. So a greater partnership between government and Parliament and civil society in that designated process. Sometimes it does become cumbersome, but that's part of the deliberative nature of democracy. What we want to do is to also make it more efficient and more democratic in its exercise and application.
Thank you, Irving. And what I've noticed from a recent statement of the Canadian government is that there is also, as a priority in the plan for 2020-2021, to make sure that the eventual assets that would be seized from abusers would be made available to victims and communities who have suffered the consequences of human rights abuses. So that is part of a mechanism that needs to be set up. I see Bill noting here, so I'm not wrong. But of course, I would also urge a consideration of the role that the judicial branch of government can play in this, given the fact that there are certain due process protections to be taken into account. Margareta, do you want to address maybe why in Europe we have seen a little bit of a slower process than in the English-speaking countries?
It's difficult to say, David, but thanks you very much for your question. And maybe because quite a lot of the European countries have strong constitutions with strong, that protect human rights. Maybe it's also that we have some glasses that protect us from seeing what goes on in the world. It might also be that there are countries who are not really, they are in authoritarian leadership that don't brighten the view. Or it might be that it's small countries, we are depending on bigger countries. That might be one point of view. But I must underline, don't only focus on the problem. Focus as well as the possibility. And I think what Bill Browder spoke about, it shows that one person can have an incredible impact on the situation. And I think that's the most important thing to focus on. What can each of us do? And also to build networks, to be in such an environment that you get inspired, that you want to do something, to act. It's maybe not for a parliamentarian to have this environment in their own country. Then be active in international organization to get empower, to get fact, to get inspiration, because it's possible to change. And that's what Bill Browder have really shown and talk about all the time. And this is important. Thank you, David.
And thank you, Margareta. And of course, the role of parliamentarians has been addressed by many actors One of them is listening to us today, maybe the most important man who is in our participants list, the former Undersecretary General and Legal Counsel of the United Nations, Ambassador Hans Corell from Sweden, who published a rule of law guide for politicians. That is also a very, very important tool that PGA and all the parliamentarians of the world should make use of to promote human rights and accountability. It's a project that he did with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Lund University, together with the Hague Institute for the Internationalization of Law in the Netherlands. You can find it easily on the internet, and we'll put on the PGA website a link to it. Now,
David, may I just say
yes.
one thing more? I think what Erwin Kotler spoke about, to involve parliamentarians, is crucial, because it's not that the government, if it's a democratic country, the government haven't the power. They are those who are running the country, but the legislative power is in the parliament, and the parliaments have possibilities to take initiatives, and are also those who scrutinize the government. So I think what Erwin Kotler said is really important. Parliamentarians has to be involved and also to act responsible. Thank you.
Absolutely. And many questions have been asking, and talking to especially Professor Kotler and Bill Browder here. Maybe Bill can have the last word on this. Are these Magnitsky-type sanctions effective as a tool for prevention or deterrence? If we look at situations like Venezuela, for example, where a lot of efforts have been made, but a parallel economic system has been created by the Maduro regime to find ways and means to sell the oil. What other toolbox? What is this an essential component of the broader toolbox that policymakers, governments, parliamentarians, international organizations should have at their disposal to fight impunity and prevent gross abuses? What else can be most complementary to the Magnitsky-type legislation and sanctions? I would give first the floor to Professor Kotler and then to Bill Browder.
Well, let me just take a particular example that you mentioned with respect to Venezuela, because I think Magnitsky sanctions were here imposed by Canada on the leaders of Venezuela, both as a means of deterrence as well as a means of securing justice for victims and accountability. But it has to also be done in concert. I was a part of an OAS panel of independent experts, which were asked to look into whether there are reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity are being committed in Venezuela. We reported a little over 2 years ago that there are reasonable grounds to believe that 7 major crimes against humanity were being committed in Venezuela, in particular state-orchestrated humanitarian sufferance, the weaponization of food and medicine and targeting the opposition, etc. We were delighted that some 6 months after our report, some 7 countries made the first ever collective referral of a state party to the ICC, International Criminal Court, Venezuela, in its history. Now, here is the complementarity of Magnitsky sanctions and reference to the International Criminal Court, where some of the information used in the adoption of Magnitsky and implementation of Magnitsky was also used with respect to the developing the breach of facts and law in that regard. And the PGA has been very involved in the promotion and protection and pursuit of justice at the ICC. So this is how one can work in concert in that regard. But one other thing, while we have been very active in Canada in a matter of Venezuela and Magnitsky sanctions and the like, we have not yet, in fact, invoked any Magnitsky sanctions with respect to any CCP officials in Xi Jinping's China or any of the senior officials in Iran. And we cannot in any way somehow indulge a culture of impunity by applying it in some cases and not applying it in others. I know there are foreign policy considerations sometimes that come into it, but we need to act in concert as a community of democracies, so no country needs to stand alone, and parliamentarians can be the bridge builders and the nexus to bringing governments and parliamentarians together.
Thank you, Professor. Bill.
So the original concept of sanctions was for a Western government to express its displeasure by sanctioning another country. And that was an extremely blunt instrument. very hard to do because it required a huge amount of political will. And it often, and almost always, ended up targeting the victims of the dictatorship, not the dictators. You know, when we sanctioned Iran, they were flying in plane loads of caviar and champagne for the top guys, and the people were suffering. The idea of Magnitsky sanctions turns the whole thing on its head. It says, let's leave the people alone. Let's leave the people who are living in an occupied country, occupied by criminals and dictators. Let's leave their victims alone. And let's specifically and surgically target the perpetrators, the individuals who are causing all the pain and all the death and all the suffering. And I get asked this all the time. How do you know it works? And there's a million ways I know it works, but the best way I can tell you why it works is how angry Putin got when we did it. He literally, I mean, he never loses his cool. He's always steely cool, just staring down. He lost his cool and has continued to lose his cool when it came to Magnitsky sanctions. And the reason he lost his cool is because a huge part of his motivation of being in power and being a dictator is to steal money. And he kills a lot of people, he imprisons a lot of people, he tortures a lot of people for money. Money is more important than human life to him. He keeps that money not in Russia, in the West. And all of a sudden, we now have a mechanism to put that money at risk. And for him, that's just horrifying. And I can tell you, on the basis of the reaction to the people who have been added to the Magnitsky sanctions list, their reaction is so clearly affected, so high, so emotional, that we know we're onto something good. Sometimes people say, well, look, you know, Putin continues doing all of his terrible things, so obviously this stuff doesn't work. And I would say, well, that's true, he does do his terrible things, but how do we know what more terrible things he might have done if he wasn't afraid of this coming down? And I would also say that if we were to sanction more people in his regime, he might do less terrible things in the future. And of course, I'm talking about Putin, but this applies to China, this applies to Iran, this applies to Venezuela, this applies to anybody. They all hate it. They're all, and it's really interesting because a lot of times these people, these dictators, don't even know about the Magnitsky Act until one of them gets sanctioned. And then all of a sudden they're running around like chickens with their heads cut off, all saying how unfair it is and how extrajudicial it is and so on and so forth, when they finally get affected. And then the local press goes crazy and says, who's going to be next, and so on and so forth. And they're all, you know, looking in the mirror, wondering if they're going to be next. And what this does is it creates a sort of, it evens the balance. I mean, of course, they have 99, they had 100% of the power. Now they have 99% of the power, but we've given 1% of the power back to the victims, back to the people who are being persecuted. And hopefully if this thing continues to be used and implemented, then maybe it goes from 1% to 10%. And it's never going to be a fair fight, but it's a lot better than total impunity.
Yes, thank you, Bill. And certainly a measure of justice is absolutely an imperative when we saw the type of policy that the Assad regime of Syria started to implement against its own people during the so-called months of the so-called Arab Spring, when essentially, thanks to the patronage and the coverage that Mr. Putin gave to Mr. Assad, we witnessed the killing of approximately 500,000 people and the decision of maybe 5 million people to become refugees in the largest and the bloodiest conflict known to this century and so far a millennium. So this is unfortunately the very same person that is behind the single assassination on one side, or the attempted one on the other side, or you know, widespread and systematic crimes against humanity. I think we are exhausting our time, and I would like to give maybe 1 minute to each of you to maybe make a comment. Before doing so, I would like to thank those who supported the realization of these events, all the staff of PGA and the Raoul Wallenberg Center, who worked as a wonderful team. This will also be, is already available on YouTube, but will also be available in the future, unless, of course, anyone here would object. Also a big thank you to Global Affairs Canada that supports the PGA campaign for democratic renewal and human rights in partnership with the Raoul Wallenberg Center. And let me also mention the fact that PGA continues in its very strong commitment to fight impunity for the most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole. It's absolutely unacceptable that a single murderer in the streets of Rome, under my house here in the face of the Vatican, will be brought to justice 90% of the cases. And those who are killing 100,000 in Yemen or in other places can rest on the fact that there will be impunity for, in Syria, of course, there will be impunity for them. So we need to absolutely change this paradigm and bring justice to make sure that globalization and the rule of law apply equally to all and not only to the privileged ones. So today we maybe have not touched upon a number of questions on a number of situations, especially in the global south, but I think the commitment is there from our side to continue the dialogue, and we'll certainly organize another one of these webinars. I now give the floor to you, probably in an alphabetic order, if you don't mind. Bill.
I'm not going to take my full minute, but I will say that if there are members of Parliament listening today whose country there's no Magnitsky initiative currently going on, please perhaps get in touch with me via Davide so that we can talk about how we can make this happen. It all started with me in Canada. It all started me with meeting Erwin through a random friend of introduction at the Houses of Parliament in London 10 years ago, and perhaps there'll be somebody listening today where we can make it happen in your country. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Davide and Margarita and Erwin for allowing me to join you on this important call.
Margareta.
Thank you, David. Could you please repeat your question once again?
Oh,
it was
I'm just giving a minute. I'm just giving a minute to close to everyone.
I would like to say, listening to Erwin Kotler and Bill Browder, I have got a lot of thoughts, and I hope all my fellow parliamentarians have done the same. But what can we do? Support a political system that's transparent. Support a political system that really make difference and that promote accountability, and also that those like the Magnitsky Act don't follow the laws, don't respect the people to do those crimes. Don't accept it. Build network as parliamentarian. Join, for example, PGA. Read. Get in touch with Bill Browder, but do something, because that's what our voters, that's what our people could expect from us as parliamentarians. And also, as parliamentarian, remember, why did you go to politics? Why did you put so much time, so much effort? It's not to sit, it's to make difference, to act. And I think I have said what's important for me. Think about rule of law. Thank you.
Thank you, Margareta. And I've seen that there are other questions. What I can say before that Professor Kotler really closes the meeting is that in our view, what we are doing today is to bring about more support, more leverage to the idea that Magnitsky sanctions should be adopted and utilized. Let's remember that we live in a real world informed by discourse around trade, business, national interest. The international interest relating to the human rights of human beings is a little bit not given the same importance in many mainstream by many mainstream actors. So that's our role here, to really push the envelope as far as we can. Now, there is the point that is being made by some of our participants here. What do we do to advance the sanctions regimes from the side of the developing countries where the abuses are committed. So here there is much more thinking that we need to maybe, I would propose that this should be the topic of our next webinar with individuals who can help us to go through technical procedures according to which in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, activists, lawyers, politicians can group together and create the conditions for action and a liaison with the countries in which this legislation exists and where these type of measures can have an impact on those who are abusing human rights of their own people. So that's the commitment that I can put on the table. Professor Kotler.
Thank you, David. I think that parliamentarians in concert with civil society, we have a unique opportunity, also a unique responsibility at this point to build a constituency of conscience, to build a constituency of action that is anchored in and inspired by the Magnitsky Sanctions movement, and to do so in order to both combat impunity and secure justice for victims, as well as accountability for the violators. That is the best testimonial that we can make for the International Day for Democracy, and thereby secure democratic renewal and resilience.
Thank you, Professor. And you gave us really the best possible words to close this event. For us, this event is a starting point. For Bill, of course, it's one of the hundreds that he might have contributed. And the same, of course, applies to Professor Kotler. But for PGA, even though we have been doing a lot in support of democratic principles, the rule of law, the fight against impunity, this area of sanction is one where we want to engage in a constructive way, in a continued way, within the framework of our strategic plan and trying to broaden the conversation to a lot of our members. So let's hope to have soon good news, Bill, from Brussels, that at least all the 27 EU member states will have the same regulation to be applied all together, not only the Baltic states or the UK, which is exiting, to take action in this crucial field. The Parliament spoke very eloquently about it, and I'm sure that the European External Action Service will put on the table a very interesting regulation, also in line with the human rights and due process. And let's maybe, Professor Kotler and Margareta Sederfeld, let's make a new appointment, maybe in a couple of months from today, involving some of our today's participants. Maybe the next webinar shouldn't be really a webinar, should be much more of a Zoom meeting with a lot of faces and a lot of interactions, so to move forward and bring this to a more dynamic and working level. I really thank everyone, and happy International Day of Democracy to all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to be with you.